Buenos días con todos. Soy
Good
Carla
morning
Sáenz.
to everyone.
Antes
My
de
name is Carla
presentarles
Sáenz,
formalmente y
and
darles la
before
bienvenida,
introducing
quiero
myself
asegurar
formally
que
and
todos
welcoming you,
tienen
I want to make
acceso a la
sure
traducción
everyone
de
has
la
access
sesión si
to
así lo necesitan,
interpretation of the
porque vamos a
session if they
tener
need it,
personas
because
presentando
we
en
will have
inglés.
people speaking
Si
in
quiere
English.
escuchar la
If
sesión
you would
en
like
español,
to listen in
vaya al
Spanish,
icono de
please
globo
go
que
to
está en
the
la
icon
parte
at the
inferior
bottom
de su
of the
pantalla
screen,
y
the
apriete
Earth
ahí y
icon.
escoja español.
Click on it and select Spanish.
I'm gonna say this in English. So if you want to listen to all the presentations in English, since we'll be doing most of the session in Spanish, although we'll have one presentation in English, please go to the click on the little globe that says interpretation and then choose English as the language. Ahora sí, retomamos la bienvenida. Soy
So
Carla
now let me go
Sáenz,
back to the
asesora regional
welcome.
de
My name is
bioética
Carla
de la
Sáenz,
OPS.
Regional Advisor on
Es un gusto
Bioethics
darles la
at
bienvenida
PAHO.
a
And
esta
it's a
nueva
pleasure
sesión de
to
nuestra
welcome
serie de
you to this
seminarios
new
virtuales
session
sobre temas
of a series
relacionados
of
con los
virtual
ensayos
seminars on
clínicos.
topics having to do with
Esta
clinical
serie de
trials.
seminarios es
This series of
coorganizada
seminars
por el
is
Programa Regional de
organized by the
Bioética,
Regional
que hace
Program
parte de
on
la Unidad de
Bioethics,
Ciencia y
which is
Conocimiento
part of
para
the
el
unit of
Impacto
Science and
del
Knowledge for
Departamento de
Impact
Evidencia
from
e
the
Inteligencia para la
Evidence and
Acción en Salud
Intelligence
y la
Department
Unidad de
for Action
Calidad y
in the Area of
Regulación de
Health, and the
Medicamentos y
Unit on
Tecnologías
Quality and
Sanitarias de
Regulation of
la OPS,
Medications
que a
and
su vez hace
Health
parte del
Technologies at
Departamento de
PAHO, which is all
Innovación,
part of the
Acceso a
Department
Medicamentos
of
y
Innovation,
Tecnologías
Access to
Sanitarias.
Medication, and Health
A
Technology.
los que estuvieran por primera
For
vez
those of you who are
sumándose
with
a esta
us for the
sesión,
first time,
los invitamos
we would like to invite
a
you
visitar nuestro portal
to
de ensayos
visit
clínicos de las
our
Américas, que lo
portal
vamos a
on
compartir
clinical
en
trials
enlace
in
en
the
breve,
Americas.
para que
We will
puedan
be sharing
escuchar
the link
seminarios
briefly
previos y
in the
además
chat
tener
so that
acceso
you can
a
listen to
otros
prior
recursos de la
seminars and
organización
also have
sobre el tema.
access to other
En
resources
esta
the
sesión
organization
vamos a
provides on
tener
this topic.
un
At this
panel
session,
sobre
we will have a
donde personas
panel
de distintas perspectivas
where people
discutirán
will, from different
cómo
perspectives, will
mejorar la
discuss
cantidad y calidad de los
how to
ensayos
improve the
clínicos en la
quality
región.
and quantity
Sin
of
embargo,
clinical trials in the region.
algo fundamental
However,
de esta sesión
one
es
of the
que es
fundamental aspects of
nuestra
this
oportunidad
session
de
is
presentar
that
la
it gives us the
orientación sobre
opportunity
mejores
to
prácticas para ensayos
introduce the
clínicos
guidance on
que
best
fue
practices for
desarrollada
clinical
inicialmente por la
trials
OMS
that was
en una
developed
adaptación de
originally
la
by
OPS para el
WHO
español
and
y
has been
portugués.
adapted by PAHO for Spanish
Vamos
and
a
Portuguese.
proceder para esta sesión de la siguiente
We
manera.
will proceed
Luego
in
de
the
una
following way at
presentación
this
del
session.
doctor Ludovic
Following
Reveis,
the
que es jefe de la
presentation of
Unidad de
Dr.
Ciencia y
Ludovic Reves,
Conocimiento
who
para
is
el
head
Impacto
of the
de
Unit of
de
Science
la
and
OPS,
Knowledge for
tendremos una
Impact at PAHO,
presentación a cargo del
we will
doctor
hear
Vasi
a
Murthy,
presentation
que
by
es el
Dr.
asesor
Vasi
principal de
Morthy, who
investigación
is
y
the
desarrollo de la
Senior
OMS,
Advisor for
y que
Research
a
for
su vez
Health
lideró el
Department Science
desarrollo
at
de la resolución de ensayos
WHO,
clínicos
and
de la
also
OMS,
helped
la
develop
publicación
the
de esta
publication of the clinical
orientación y
trials,
en general
the
de los esfuerzos
guidance,
globales para
and
impulsar la
also all
implementación de
global
esta
efforts to
resolución.
encourage the implementation
Luego
of the World
se
Health
sumará a nuestra
Organization's
colega Sara Carracedo del
resolution.
Programa Regional de
Following that, we
Bioética
will
de la
have
OPS,
our
que
colleague
presentará el
Sara
panel y
Carracedo,
moderará
who
la
will
discusión.
introduce the panel and
Sin
will
más
moderate the
preámbulo,
discussion.
le doy la
So without any
palabra
further
a
ado, I
el
now would
doctor
like to
Ludovic
call on
Reveis.
Dr.
Gracias.
Ludovic Reves. Thank you.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias,
Thank
Carla,
you
y
very much,
buenos
Carla.
días a todos y todas.
Good
Permítanme un
morning to
segundo,
everyone. Give me just a second
voy a compartir
so
la
Perdone,
that I
pantalla.
can
mientras que
put
el
my
doctor Reveis
slides
comparte
up.
su
While
pantalla,
Dr.
quiero
Reves shares his screen,
recordar
I
un par
also
de
like to
cosas que me
remind you
olvidé
a
de
few things that
decirles.
I forget to
Primero
mention.
que, si
First
por
of
favor
all,
nos pueden poner sus preguntas usando la
please
función de preguntas y
ask your
respuestas.
questions in the Q&A
Pueden
function.
compartir
There you can
mensajes,
share messages
recursos por medio del chat,
and
pero
mention, excuse me,
más
under the chat,
fácil
you can
ver las
send messages
preguntas
and
por
mention
medio de la
resources,
función
but we find it
específica.
easier to look at the questions
Adicionalmente,
if you
queremos
put them in
resaltar
the
que no
Q&A
se dará
section
un
specifically.
certificado
Also, I'd like to say we will not issue a certificate for participation in this seminar, but the seminar will be recorded and disseminated as prior seminars have been done through the list of ethical research, through the website of the regional program on bioethics, and more importantly, through our portal on clinical trials for the Americas. So go ahead, Dr. Ludovic.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias,
Thank
Carla.
you very much, Carla.
Como en el título de este
And
webinario es cómo
as you
promover
can see in the
más y
title of
mejores
this
ensayos
seminar,
clínicos,
how
¿verdad? Y entonces,
to
¿a qué nos
promote
referimos
more and better clinical
a
trials.
esto?
And what do we mean by
Eh,
this?
Son tres
This
gráficas que muestran tres informaciones
are three
diferentes. La
slides that
primera,
give
a la
you three
izquierda
bits of
arriba,
information. Top
es una
left
gráfica que lo que muestra
is
son
a
todos los
graph that
ensayos
shows you
clínicos
all the clinical trials
terapéuticos de medicamentos que se
for
hicieron durante la
therapeutic ones for
pandemia y que fueron
medication that were
incluidos en
performed
una
during the
revisión médica que
pandemic
nosotros
and were
hicimos
included in
para
a
COVID. Y como
review
ustedes pueden ver,
publication that we did
la
during
línea azul
COVID.
muestra el
As you
total
can
de los
see, the blue
estudios
line
que al
shows the
final de
total number
nuestra
of
última
studies.
revisión
And at the end of our
en el
last review
2023,
in 2023,
incorporamos casi 1000
we
ensayos
included
clínicos.
almost 1,000
Las
clinical
rayas rojas
trials.
son el número
The
de
red
intervenciones que
line
ustedes
is the
ven.
number
Llegamos
of
casi a 300,
interventions.
un poco
We
más de
reached
300
almost
diferentes intervenciones.
300 different
Y
interventions.
la raya
And
amarilla
the
muestra las
yellow line
intervenciones en la cual
shows
había
the
suficiente
interventions
evidencia
where there was
para tomar
sufficient
una decisión.
evidence
Y como
to
ustedes pueden
make a
ver,
decision.
esa
So
raya
as you
amarilla
can
muestra
see,
muy
that
pocas
yellow line
intervenciones sobre las
shows
cuales
very
realmente se
few
pudo tener
interventions on
una
which we
decisión para
could make
recomendar
a final
posteriormente
decision to
medicamentos.
recommend a medication.
Esto pues nos muestra
This
que hubo una gran cantidad de
demonstrates
ensayos
that
clínicos.
there's a large number of
Como
clinical
sabemos, pues
trials,
muchos de esos ensayos
but
clínicos
as we
fueron
know,
estudios
many of those clinical
pequeños
trials were small
que la
trials
calidad no fue
and
necesariamente la
the
mejor.
quality
Y
wasn't
cuando empezamos
necessarily
a
the
hacer
best.
análisis de lo que
And
se
so
hizo en el
when
interior,
we
encontramos
analyzed
también que
what was done
hubo
in the region,
una gran
we
respuesta,
also
o sea, hubo
found
bastantes
that
estudios,
there were a
pero
lot of
muchos de ellos
studies, a big response
con
to
tamaños de muestras
undertaking
pequeños
studies,
y
but
con
many of
procesos
them had
de
very
metodologías pues muy
small
frecuentes de error.
samples and
Entonces, esto es un primer problema y es
not
la
excellent
calidad.
methodological
Por otro lado,
controls.
nos
So
muestra que
that's
hay
a
capacidad y
problem. It
particularmente en
shows us
esta
that there
región.
is capacity in the
La
region.
gráfica de la
The
derecha
graph on the
arriba
right
son simplemente
shows
el número de
you
ensayos
the
clínicos
number of
que se
clinical
hacen en América
trials
Latina y el Caribe
performed in Latin
y
America and
que
the
se identifican
Caribbean
en PubMed. Entonces, como
and that
ustedes
are
pueden ver, ha habido un
identified in
incremento a lo
PubMed.
largo de los
So as you
años.
can see, there has been
En
an
el
increase over the years
2020,
in
21, 22 y
2021,
23,
22, and
particularmente el 22 hubo
23. Particularly in
una gran
22,
cantidad de
there was
estudios,
a large number
casi
of studies done.
2.283
Almost
ensayos clínicos fueron
2,284 clinical
realizados
trials were
ese año y
performed
publicados
that
en
year
revistas que están
and
indexadas
published
en PubMed,
in
pero
magazines listed in
es un
PubMed.
número que cuando lo
But
comparamos
it's a
con lo que se
number
hace a nivel
when you
global
compare
sigue
it to
siendo
what
un
is done
número
at the
pequeño.
global
Entonces,
level is still very small.
obviamente
So
es una oportunidad
obviously,
para hacer un poco
it's an
más de
opportunity
investigación
to
en ensayos clínicos.
do
Y la tercera
more
información esta es
research through
información
clinical
sacada
trials.
del
And
2023
the
de 7
third
países, son los 7 países que más
information,
producen
it
ensayos
was
clínicos
produced by the seven
en
countries
América
that most
Latina.
produce
Y como
clinical
ustedes
trials in
pueden
Latin
ver,
America. And as
la
you can
mayoría de los
see,
estudios son
most of
fase
the
3.
studies were phase
Hay un
3.
porcentaje importante son fase 2, muy pocos son
A significant
fases iniciales
percentage was phase 2,
concretamente. Entonces,
but
hay
very few in phase
definitivamente
1. So
necesidad
there
y es
is a
importante siempre
need
generar innovación
to
clarísimamente.
increase innovation
¿Qué pasó? Y no
in
solamente en la
trials.
región, sino a nivel
Now, what
global,
happened not only in
se
the
vio
region,
pues
but
que
globally,
hubo
we saw
necesidad
that
de una mejor
there
coordinación y una
was
mejor
a
calidad en los
need
ensayos
for
clínicos.
greater
Entonces,
coordination
la
and better
resolución de
clinical
la OMS, que
quality.
ahora Basi de pronto nos
That
va a
is why
comentar un poco
WHO
más
has come up with these
en concreto.
recommendations.
Y al mismo tiempo,
Dr.
dentro de la
Vasi will
organización
speak
se
about it more
generaron varios
concretely.
documentos, por ejemplo,
But
este de catalizar la investigación
several
ética en
research
emergencias,
documents
otros
were
relacionados con acreditación de comités de
came out. For
ética.
instance, the one
O sea,
on
hubo
catalyzing research,
varias orientaciones tratando pues de
ethical research
fortalecer y
in
mejorar la
emergencies,
calidad
and
de los estudios.
there was a
Como
workshop on
parte
how to
de
improve
este
the quality
proceso
of studies. As part of this
de generar
study,
pues
this
una
effort
visión
to
diferente de
generate a
cómo
different
cambiar la manera como estamos haciendo la investigación,
vision of how we do
tuvimos un ensayo
research,
regional
we held a
en
regional
Brasilia en
workshop in Brasilia in October of 2023. More than 22 countries were present. And there we discussed several topics, and I'll mention this a bit more. Here you can see the report that is available online from that meeting. And there were basically 4 components included. First, how to develop high impact clinical trials, how to improve capacity in research. Third was how to develop networks for clinical trials. And fourth, improve ethical efficiency and regulatory efficiency. These were the first components, but as there were also a lot of recommendations that came out in the report and in the reports that came out of the global meetings and meetings in other regions. So as a result, the first thing we decided to do was to develop this portal of clinical trials in the Americas. There you will find many of the activities and products we have available in the organization and all the documents and information on webinars, workshops, or documents and any guidance that is available in the region. So this portal will be put, the link will be put in the chat so that you can go to it and obtain more information. Now, we firmly believe that we have to go much further. That's why we have introduced this concept of the accelerator for clinical trials. What we're trying to do through this is to implement the recommendations that appear in the regional report and from the Global Plan for Clinical Trials of WHO, and we want to focus on regulatory aspects, obviously, and on how to adopt harmonization at country levels and how to develop capacity, how to strengthen collaboration and data sharing, and then what to do with the outcome and results of the research. So that's what the accelerator is trying to do with each one of these sectors, and want to go into greater detail in each of these sections and encourage the use and application of this in the region. These are some of the activities and initial activities we've undertaken. As you know, these webinars are taking place almost on a monthly basis on different topics, and they are there for educational resources. We have an ethical framework for collaboration in research, which is very important. It's easy to talk about collaboration, but when you go getting down to the details as to how to collaborate, how to balance the various institutions that are collaborating, we thought that it was important to develop an ethical framework for that. So we are publishing something on this. Also, PAHO has been working on the national standards to make sure they are harmonized with international standards and are consistent. There's also a forum of regulators for clinical trials and a forum for national entities that supervise ethical committees. We also want to develop a tool for clinical trials. We know, for instance, the platform where you register clinical trials, where the studies that are underway or have been completed are registered. There's more than 1 million studies that have been registered. We also have the publications that come out in different databases, and if with artificial intelligence, we could develop digital tools that improve cooperation, scanning the horizon, and use intelligence to find out what's going on. Just to give you an example, if today I wanted to find out who is financing research about a specific type of cancer in children and who are the main investigators in the different countries, with whom could I work, that information is difficult to find today. So the data is available, but it's difficult to have access to a lot of this information easily. So that's what we want to try to create. We also want to develop a network of clinical trials and tools for new networks and contract models and insurance policies and evaluation of continuous evaluation of the regional panorama. So these are some of the things that we are developing with several partners in the region. And finally, as I said, here's the QR code to access the portal. And now stop here and call on Dr. Vassi, who will give a presentation on the global panorama. Thank you. Vassi, go ahead.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm also going to try and share some slides. Let's see if that's going to work. I think you should be able to see my my slides now.
Yes,
so firstly,
we do.
In the 10 minutes that I have, I would like to just give you some background from the global perspective on this work that PAHO is leading. And it's been such a pleasure to work with the PAHO team. They are the first team from the 6 regions to have been able to go ahead and adapt the local language versions of the guidance. So congratulations to them for being first. This is one step in a process that I would like to give you some background from my perspective, from WHO's perspective. So here in one graphic, this shows the Global World Health Assembly resolution that was passed in 2022. I just want to look at my watch to make sure I don't overrun. So this resolution was passed after discussion with the ministers, secretaries of health of all countries in the world. And really it is, let's go back to some real fundamental aspects. This is another reaffirmation that we have 2 absolutely fundamental foundations for all of the work in health. On the one hand, science and research, and on the other hand, the ethical underpinning to absolutely everything that we do. And it is really focusing on the fact that generally it is agreed that the highest quality evidence will come from scientifically appropriately designed and ethically well conducted and designed clinical trials. So if we do not have good clinical trials, then we don't have the best evidence for decision making. During the pandemic, it was loud and clear, and Dr. Reveilles outlined this from the PAHO perspective, that this did not work very well. We did have some good examples of clinical trials that led to information that allowed us to bring in therapeutics and vaccines, but most of the clinical trials that were done were useless. So this was a major problem, and that led really to the resolution. Of course, those issues are not specific to COVID, they're long-standing issues, but they came to the fore, and that's what led to this resolution, which is in no way specific to emerging infectious diseases or pandemics. It covers all diseases and health condition areas. We were required by that resolution to develop this WHO guidance, and I want to thank here everybody in PAHO who took part in the consultation process that fed into the development of the guidance. We had our technical advisory group members, including I think Professor Salas from Chile is on the line. She was one of the members of the technical advisory group, and there were many other inputs that we received from PAHO. So that led to the English version that was published in September, and now the Spanish and Portuguese adaptations that are being launched here. There is a global action plan, which is really nothing new substantively, but it is a reformulation of what is in that WHO guidance. And that guidance is not coming in a vacuum. There are many existing standards that this is really adding to and complements. In the consultation process, there were these 4 high-level areas that we were asked to make sure that we address as far as possible in the guidance. How, as Dr. Reveilles talked to, how can we ensure that more of the clinical trials are well designed? And our guidance speaks to that. Another major issue was around lack of engagement of patients, public communities, their involvement in the whole trial life cycle. And how do we make sure that the populations that are included in clinical trials actually represent the populations that the interventions are intended to benefit? How do we develop trial infrastructure and capabilities where they don't exist adequately? And how do we move to really an enabling clinical trial environment, getting past existing inefficiencies? So in the guidance, to be as brief as I can and allow as much time for discussion, there is one section, which is the second section, which has these 5 elements. And these need to be taken in conjunction with all of the key existing standards, including obviously the Declaration of Helsinki, the associated SIOMS guidance. There is also the ICH guidance, which is very important if you are developing new biomedical innovations which are going to need to be authorized by the National Medicinal Product Regulatory Agency. So this is really in addition to all of those, but this is a high-level conceptual framework of 5 key elements that we think are, without any one of these, you cannot say that your trial is good. So is it appropriately designed to produce scientifically sound answers to questions which are really relevant to the patients and the populations and the participants? Are the rights and well-being of participants respected? Thirdly, we have a major focus, really much more of a focus than in the ICH guidance, on collaboration with the relevant stakeholders. So here again, patients, community organizations, and others. Transparency through registration and reporting of results. We also have a much bigger focus than in ICH on ensuring that trials are feasible for the context where they are implemented. A major strand of the international work is that often trials are actually designed in countries, some proportion of the trials are designed in countries where they're not implemented. So it's really essential that we see centrally the need to prospectively ensure that the trials are feasible for the context that they're implemented. And we have a major focus fully in line with ICH on risk-based quality management. So all of this is aligned to and complementary to the existing standards. And there's been quite a major evolution in the global standards situation for clinical research with the Declaration of Helsinki, ICH E6R3 and the WHO guidance. So it's really a good time for everybody working in this space to think about what they need to adapt at the national level to ensure they're up to date. So that's section 2. In section 3, we have these 4 pillars, which it may be that you're already very well advanced in the countries that you're working in, or it may be that when you look at this section 3, there are certain elements where you think, if you're in the Ministry of Health, that we have more to do. So these 4 pillars, and of course, the ethical underpinnings are really over and above all of this, and the importance of the quality from a scientific perspective also. But the 4 pillars are the national research governance, policy, framework, funding, and coordination that is really coming from clarity about what exists in the national guidance, policy, regulation, standards documents. Secondly, at the institutional level, what do you have that provides the infrastructure and capabilities to conduct clinical research? Thirdly, the research ethics oversight. Fourthly, the regulatory systems, the medicinal product regulators, and then there are a number of cross-cutting areas. So in this document, you can look at this and you can begin to compare this to the baseline situation in a country and look at what some of the next steps may be. We have these 2 existing areas where we have WHO guidance. There's research ethics oversight and there's PAHO specific tools for this. There's also the global benchmarking tool for national regulatory authorities. Just to let you know that a separate strand of work is that we are at an advanced draft stage with a clinical trial unit maturity framework, which we now have time for very serious input from the regional and the country level before we take this forward, so that we can take that into account and change it as needed. But once that is finalized, after review of the draft and piloting in a number of countries around the world, which we have funding to support, we will then have a global framework for any institution, any clinical research institution, to look at the scope of practice that they're interested in. So it could be just participating as a site, or it could be really leading, coordinating a site study and look at what WHO is calling out as the next steps for improving your capabilities there. So that's another major development that's in process. The Global Action Plan has these 9 areas, and just very briefly, I won't go over time, but to say that all of these are really important. So strengthening local leadership and national support for sustained infrastructure and funding. I think a major direction that we're really trying to advocate here is just the clarity that the international donor support is clearly necessary and a part of the picture, but ultimately it is really going to take local leadership, including some domestic support for the core infrastructures and capabilities that are needed, the research managers, the coordinators that really this cannot function with them only working from project funding, because the capacities will be lost and the people will leave. The big focus on engagement and involvement of patients, communities, the public, big focus also in the resolution on trying to correct the current total disconnect that we have in many areas where the populations that are involved in clinical trials do not really at all represent the populations that are most in need of the interventions, including but not restricted to children, pregnant and lactating women, older adults, those with various neglected conditions, which could be rare diseases or neglected tropical diseases, or those living in places which have been traditionally considered hard to reach, and maybe the research hasn't been happening there. There's a huge scope of work on moving towards adoption of innovative designs, including adaptive designs, platform trials, decentralized designs, perpetual models, and WHO will do whatever we can to try to address the inequities that exist here, where a lot of these types of approaches are currently led by a few global centers. We really need equitable access to capacities to really take forward these innovative designs. Training is absolutely critical, and from WHO's perspective, this is another area in addition to the clinical trial unit maturity framework, where we are going to be developing a resource, a global clinical trials resource training hub, where we want to signpost key materials that are available so that people have access to the best information for what they need. And this is not only for full-time researchers, but also for others. So for clinical practitioners, for nurses to be involved, they need their own sort of nuanced training material to be involved in clinical trials, as well as material for research ethics committees and for regulators that are involved in reviewing dossiers. We have a whole stream on improving coordination and, where appropriate, streamlining of regulatory and ethics review. And I think there's a lot to be learned from AVREF, which is an African approach where they have all of the countries around Africa now really coordinating together, the regulatory authorities and the research ethics committees, often providing one list of questions back to sponsors, where there may be 25 authorities that are involved in the review, but retaining their autonomy for approval. There's a big agenda around pragmatic trials. We can do a lot more, so that we should not be thinking that clinical trials here are only trials of new innovations, pre-licensure trials, but there are so many questions that can be answered with available interventions. Some of these may be cluster randomized trials that are not even trials of pre-licensure products at all. They may not even involve medicines or vaccines, for example, behavioral interventions. So this is a big agenda, and the regulatory frameworks need to be adapted to support these appropriately. The clinical trial registries need to be supported in the national guidance and funded. And then, of course, we need to support international networks where it is mutually beneficial. There are certain questions that cannot be answered through national trials, and the only way to do them is through international approaches. And then we need to agree how we're going to measure outcomes of all of the changes that are needed at the institutional, national, and international level. For time, I won't go through these, but these are the sort of agendas for change that come out of what the WHO guidance is talking about. And there's also a whole set of activities that will take us to the enabling environment, where we have sustained capacities, so that clinical trials really are aligned with local and national needs, and are not just stopping and starting according to international project funds. This is our big vision of where we want to get to. In terms of next steps, this is the first of the 2 translations that have been published. As I said, PAHO is ahead, but we are working with the regional offices, so French, Arabic, Chinese, Russian. There are going to be launch events in all of these languages. And we're also, just to mention that there is this one training set of modules, which is really taking this section 2 that I mentioned and developing a WHO online training course. But most of what we're doing in training is really going to be curating existing training material and signposting, and where necessary, helping with translations. So hopefully that gives you an overview from the global level. But most importantly, as I said, I don't think this in itself really achieves anything. Our publishing the first version of the English guidance, I don't see that as an achievement in itself. The achievements really are where you as stakeholders see any of this as being relevant to what you're doing, and we begin to take forward these changes which really improve the quality of evidence so that interventions become available and are used optimally to improve the lives and the well-being of people in the countries that you're working. That's the very practical outcome that we're looking for. So please don't see this as an abstract exercise. We want it to move towards practical tools, implementation, and uptake. And if any of you would like to discuss with me at the global level about involvement in this global clinical trial forum network, then please feel free to reach out to me, but that's not the topic of this webinar. This is our funding. Just to say that we have funding from the UK National Institute of Health Research and the UK Department of Health and Social Care, as well as the Gates Foundation and EDCTP. And we have not repeated anything where there was existing guidance. We've incorporated or adapted it with permission. These are some of the WHO, PAHO, and other HQ regional office staff who are have their own big agendas where some of it is overlapping with this work that is taking forward the resolution, and I thank all of them for their work. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Carla, I think, or is it Sarah now?
Thank you, Basi. Buenas tardes con todos. Muchas
Good
gracias por
afternoon,
participar en el
everyone, and thank you
webinar
very much
de
for
hoy.
participating in
Voy a
today's
pedirle a
webinar.
los panelistas que
I
abran
am
sus
going to
cámaras
ask
para ir
the
presentándolos y
panelists to
empezar
turn on their
un
cameras
poco la
as I
discusión.
introduce them so that we can get started with our discussion.
Tenemos a Francisca Rodríguez.
We
ella es
have
gerente de innovación
Francisca
y salud
Rodriguez,
de la
who
Cámara de
is
la
the
Innovación
Manager of Innovation and Health
Farmacéutica
at
de
the
Chile.
Chamber
Luis
of
Felipe Reyes,
Pharmaceutical
quien es
Innovation in
médico
Chile. We
intensivista y
also
trabaja en la
have
Universidad de La Sabana
Luis Felipe
y la
Reyes,
Universidad de Oxford.
the
Y
international
a
PAHO
Patricia
consultant who also works at
Saidón,
the
que es
University of Oxford, and
gestora
also Patricia Saidon,
internacional de la
who's an
Unidad de Calidad
international
y
PAHO
Regulación de
consultant in the
Medicamentos y
Quality and
Tecnologías
Regulation of
Sanitarias
Medicines
del
and Health
Departamento de
Technologies
Innovación,
Unit
Acceso a
in the
Medicamentos y
Department
Tecnologías
of
Sanitarias
um,
de la OEPS. Y a Karma Sáenz, asesora
Innovation,
regional de
Evidence and Intelligence for
la
Action and
OEPS,
Health
de
Unit,
bioética de la OEPS.
and also
Antes
Bioethics at PAHO.
de empezar, quizás
Before
cada
we
uno
get
pueda
started, perhaps
decirnos
each
un
of
poco más su
you could tell us
experiencia
just a little bit more
en
about
el
your
tema de
own
los ensayos
experience
clínicos. Y me
with
gustaría también
clinical
aprovechar el
trials. And I
tiempo
also would like to
para
take this
que nos
opportunity
cuenten un poco sobre la
to invite
base
you to tell us a
también de lo
little
que
bit
Ludovic y Basi nos
based
han
on what
presentado,
Ludovic and
la
Vasi have
importancia
presented to us. Tell us a little
de
bit
tener ensayos
about
clínicos, de hacer
the
ensayos
importance
clínicos
of conducting
de
clinical
calidad en la
trials,
región, así como
that is to
algunos
say, high
un par de
quality clinical
obstáculos
trials in our
prominentes
region, as well as
que
some
ustedes creen que
obstacles that
dificultan
you
esta realización de
believe
ensayos clínicos,
hinder
como
the
también
completion of clinical
algunas
trials,
posibles
and
soluciones que tengan
also
en
some
mente
potential
para
solutions you might have in mind
poder, digamos, sobrepasar estos
to
obstáculos.
which will allow us
Quizás
to
podamos
overcome these
empezar
obstacles.
con
Perhaps we
Francisca.
could start with Francisca.
Muchas gracias, Sara.
Thank you
Muchas
very much,
gracias
Sarah.
a la OPS
And
por la
I thank
invitación y
PAHO for
por
the invitation
llevar todos estos webinars que
and for
somos
holding these
fans de
webinars.
ellos, muchos de los que están acá.
And many of us here are big fans of these
Primero,
PAHO
bueno, quiero
webinars.
partir
I'd like to start by giving a bit of context to the clinical trials. Ludovic mentioned this in his presentation. In 2023, about 5,000 clinical trials started, but generally in our region, we represent about 5 to 6% of all the clinical trials that are conducted in the world. This shows that we have a lot of room for growth in terms of the number of clinical trials being conducted today. Why is this so important? Amongst the questions you asked, Sarah, is in terms of impact. It's very easy to think about the impact this might have on the patients and people who participate in these trials and on the health system. But there's something that we haven't mentioned, which might not seem as obvious, and that is impact on the development of the country and its economy. And the International Monetary Fund have shown that if a country has a 10% increase in research, that represents a 0.3% increase in national production. And the countries in the region that do the most clinical trials generally, for example, Argentina spends on specific clinical trials. The investment is about $500 million, according to one study conducted by the Undersecretary of Science and Technology of Argentina. And this represents about 42% of private investment. In Mexico, it's about $200 million, and in Chile, it's about $122 million. These are figures based on recently held studies, but there are some barriers that prevent us from showing but they show us a little bit of the impact of clinical trials. And now, leaving behind the economic side, let's look at the impact it has on health studies. Many studies show that it allows you to improve the quality of health systems, not only in terms of implementing clinical trials, but also it improves the health outcomes. It fosters further research in the health system, and it benefits networks and startups. And then obviously people improve their own health, but it also improves people's understanding of their care, the quality of that care in terms of whatever disease is being studied. So I think it is very important to understand the impact of implementation of clinical trials in countries. And one of the main barriers that we have today in Latin America, to not have clear indicators that show XY impact, that has led to a situation in which many countries of the region do not have a strategy or a national policy to encourage the implementation of clinical trials. This is very relevant. There are countries precisely that are leaders in clinical trials in the region. There we have Brazil, which ranks first in the region, then Argentina, Mexico, followed by Chile. But none of those countries obviously, they have various rules and standards and isolated policies, but there's no overall national policy to promote the development of clinical trials in the country. Therefore, I would say that is the first and biggest barrier. And this, along with the fact that in many countries of the region, there is no individual who looks at the overall situation and all the various stages of clinical trials. We have people working in isolation on different aspects. We look at ethics related to clinical trials, regulatory approval, but we don't have someone who looks at the situation as a whole. So that makes it harder to have overall policies governing clinical trials in the countries. And in my view, that is the biggest barrier. The next thing is in terms of capacity, and this was mentioned.
better development of capacity, not only amongst professional researchers, but also monitors, more courses to include this, not only in postgraduate, but also in pre-graduate, so that there's a better understanding and knowledge of what a clinical trial is amongst health professionals. It seems that today, in many countries in the region, it's an effort undertaken by a few who are very interested in research, push research, but it does not allow for coordination amongst themselves, a clear research network. So many along the way get tired and from having to do all this work. So the generation of capacity is another key factor. Another thing has to do with the actual process for implementing a clinical trial, where the most relevant, and we see this in various stages of the execution process, a lot has to do with the moment one starts a clinical trial. The time it takes for approval, regulatory approval, and approval by ethics committees is a key factor. What happens today? There are some ethics committees that are very quick, others are very slow. The regulations are some done quickly and very slowly in some countries, which all has led to inequality, where some countries have lost the opportunity to do more clinical trials. Even within the same country, there are some hospitals, care centers that have lost this opportunity because of the delay in approving their request. And afterwards, we can talk about why this happens and what a solution would be. But it's because of the delay from the ethics committee or the different steps in the process. I think those are what I see as the most relevant barriers. We can also talk about this and see if we can come up with some possible solutions. Thank you, Francisca. Luis Felipe, why don't you tell us a bit from your perspective? Thank you very much for this invitation and for this opportunity to participate in this panel with all these distinguished authorities for clinical trials in Latin America. I'd like to talk a bit about the limitations we have in the area of clinical trials in Latin America. I agree clearly with what Francisca was saying, which is that we have limitations in terms of the institutional and regulatory infrastructure of countries. And as Francisca was saying, this limitation is due to the state regulatory centers as well as the local ethics committees. There is no homogeneity, neither in process nor the types of regulations amongst the various regulatory bodies within a region. So when one has to do a clinical trial and include more than one country in Latin America, we find that the different countries have different regulations, and that makes it extremely difficult to navigate the strategy of undertaking multinational trials in our region. Another significant limitation is that there is no technical capacity nor professionalization of to perform clinical trials in many countries in the region. For instance, in Colombia and other Latin American countries, the academic clinical trials, or those that are crucial for the local health systems, are usually generated through the clinical questions raised by those who are providing care to the patients. And in this context, these people very often don't have enough time to devote to research. They do it through their clinical practice, but it makes it very difficult to ensure quality and commitment to different projects. So there has to be a culture to professionalize science and try to find a strategy so as to ensure that those people who are trying to find solutions to the problems in our region have enough time and have the proper infrastructure to be able to generate those responses and answers to the relevant clinical questions in our countries. There's another very serious problem with financing. As Francisca said, and the governments invest very little in the development and research in their own region. And if we focus on clinical trials, the investment is even lower. So we need to find a way of financing projects that is not exclusively dependent on governments. We need to have a multisectoral involvement to try to bring together different efforts to make sure we have quality science taking place within the region. Also, I think we're working in big silos within the countries in Latin America, and that creates major problems. Brazil, for instance, is an example to follow for how to do science, how to do clinical trials, how to find solutions or responses to relevant clinical problems. But it's difficult to collaborate between the different countries when some countries have very strong local networks, and therefore try to bring together and consolidate these various research networks is difficult, and we need to make that path easier. And by doing so, we will also be able to generate research questions that are applicable to the entire region, not just to one specific country. So in conclusion, I would say that we need to continue working on developing research capacity, in strengthening human talent, and in providing enough time for research and professionalize the people who care for patients so that they can do proper research. It's also important to design clinical trials that can be integrated into clinical practice, that can be performed during clinical practice, but that are also people that have enough time in which they're allowed to do this. Also important, we have to homogenize and standardize the regulatory entities. There needs to be an effort to standardize and encourage the development of clinical trials in the region and develop research policies that can be transferred from one country to another so that we don't have to navigate all kinds of obstacles in order to perform a clinical trial in the region. Thank you.
Gracias, Felipe. Carla,
Thank you, Felipe. Carlos, shall we go back to you and then we'll go to Patricia? Yes, of course. These panels, it's so interesting to see how we all come to the same conclusions, even though we have so many different perspectives and we work in such different areas. That, I think, should be a source of encouragement to help us find solutions. It means that we're not in disagreement on the problem. I think we all agree on the problem, but what's happening is that it's difficult for us to find and execute certain solutions. I'd like to underscore the importance of creating capacity to lead research in our region. If we can't lead research in our region, we're not going to be able to meet our own health needs or the specific challenges that occur in our own scenarios that are part of our own health system. It's like we're always sitting in the back seat and somebody else in another part of the world is driving the car. We're praying for it to go where we want it to go, but that's all. That situation has to change. We as a region, and I refer specifically to Latin America and the Caribbean, have to be able to not only lead a research that meets our own health needs, needs and our own
sino además tenemos que
specific
ser
challenges,
capaces de
but we also
utilizar lo que en
have
alguna
to be
oportunidad
able
yo he
to
referido como la
do what
visión que nosotros en la
sometimes
OPS
I've said,
tenemos para los ensayos
I
clínicos
refer
en
to
la
as
región.
our
Y
vision
ser
for
capaces de hacer
clinical
un
trials in the
gran
region.
ensayo
In
clínico
other words, be able
liderado,
to do a
iniciado,
big clinical
conducido
trial led
enteramente
uh,
por Latinoamérica y el Caribe. No que
completely
nos
by
invite
Latin
algún
America and the
país de
Caribbean,
altos
not
recursos y
for us
nosotros
to
nos
just be
sumamos al gozo,
invited by a high
sino que
income
nosotros
country to join
conduzcamos
them
este coche
and
en
we
todo
sit
lo
in the
que
back
esto
seat.
implica.
No, we want to be the chauffeurs
Coincido
of
con
the
los
vehicle.
desafíos.
And I
Yo quiero
agree with the
mencionar algunos
challenges that have been
adicionales,
mentioned, but I'd like to
o
add a few
algunos
more
aspectos
or
adicionales de
some
lo que han
additional
mencionado.
aspects to what
Creo que
others
son
have
todos
mentioned so
temas
far.
muy interrelacionados.
And I think these are
Un
all really
desafío que
interrelated
vemos
issues.
mucho, y
One
luego hablará
challenge
más
we
desde su
often
perspectiva
see,
Patricia.
and
Patricia y yo
Patricia
trabajamos
will
muy
speak more about this from
cercanamente,
her
Sara,
perspective.
Patricia y yo trabajamos muy
Patricia,
cercanamente
Sara, and
con
I
las
work very
autoridades nacionales,
closely
con los
with the
Estados
national
miembros,
authorities and the member states
no
in
solamente buscando
trying to
una
solve,
armonización,
not,
buscando
not
que
just trying to
todos nos
find
adhiramos a los
a
estándares
standardization,
internacionales y
not
hablará de los
just trying to
buenas
ensure that
prácticas
everybody
clínicas, que
abides
son
by
los que
international
competen desde el lado
standards and good
regulatorio,
clinical
desde el lado de
practices
la ética,
from the
los
perspective
estándares
of
éticos
regulation and
internacionales, de las
ethics,
pautas de ciencia,
following the
son
international
el estándar más
ethical
actual y
standards,
actualizado
SIOMS
que
guidelines, which are the
disponemos.
most updated
Pero
guidelines we
un
have.
problema específico que muchas veces nos ocupa,
There's another
puse un
very
par de
specific problem that
infografías ahí
often
que
concerns
pudieran
us,
ayudar
and I have a
aclarar
few
eso,
infographics that
es
could
que
help
suele
clarify
haber una
this, is that
confusión
there often
sobre
is
qué significa
confusion
hacer la
as to
supervisión ética de la
what
investigación y qué
does it mean to
significa
have
hacer la
ethical
supervisión regulatoria de
supervision
investigación.
of
Y a veces
research,
vemos
and
situaciones en
what does
que
it mean to have
el
regulatory
regulador actúa
supervision
de
of
comité de ética.
research?
El comité
But
de
at one
ética
time, the
trata de hacer el trabajo
regulator
regulador.
acts as the ethical committee, and the ethics
Primero,
committee tries to
zapatos
do the
zapatos.
regulation.
Cada uno tiene que
These are
hacer
two
lo que
different
tiene,
functions.
lo que le
Each
compete,
needs
lo que
to
además tiene el
perform
entrenamiento de hacer
what it
para
is
hacerlo.
trained to
Y
do
además
and what
porque cuando
its
nos ponemos a
area
hacer el
of
trabajo de otros,
competence is. Because
acabamos
once we
dejando de hacer
start
el
doing
trabajo que nos corresponde. Y
others'
acaban
work, we don't do our own
cayéndose
work.
cosas por
And
las
so
rendijas que son
things fall within the
fundamentales para
cracks
ensayos
that
éticos
are
rigurosos,
crucial
seguros
to
y que
have a
produzcan
rigorous ethical
datos de valor para
trial
la sociedad.
that produces
Entonces,
data that is valuable for
creo que
society.
estamos
So
en un
I
muy
think
buen momento
we are at a very
a
good moment
nivel
right now,
regional, en
at
que
a
muchos
good
países, estamos
moment
trabajando con
regionally,
muchísimos
where
países
many
para
countries
ajustar,
are
desarrollar y
trying to
modificar o lo que
adapt,
toque
develop,
hacer con los
modify,
marcos
or
normativos
whatever
existentes
needs to be
para que
done to their
primero se
existing
adhieran a los
regulatory
estándares
frameworks
internacionales
so as
correspondientes
to,
y
first of all,
segundo,
comply
cuando
with
hubiera algún
international
desorden y la
standards,
autoridad
and
regulatoria
secondly,
esté
when there
haciendo
is
cosas que no
any
le
kind
tocan,
of
pues
a
vaya a ser
problem and the
multado. Cuando el
regulatory
comité de
authorities doing
ética
what
esté
it shouldn't be
tratando
doing,
de, por
it's told
ejemplo, de
it
usar
has to stick to its
estándares
own area.
regulatorios
Or when the
para
ethics committee
encuestas
is
o
trying
para
to
otro tipo de
develop
ensayos clínicos
regulatory
que no son de
standards
productos
for clinical trials,
que
which
buscan la
is not its
autorización de la
function,
ARN, pues se
then
haga el ajuste correspondiente.
make the
Entonces,
corresponding
esos
changes.
son,
So
yo creo que todos teníamos la idea
I think
que
we
había
all
un poquito de
had the
confusión
idea that there was a
sobre
bit
estos
of
dos ámbitos,
confusion on
pero
these
yo me
two
sigo
different
sorprendiendo de
areas of
que la
expertise,
confusión
but
es
I
mayor a la
continue to
que yo
see
misma había
that the
anticipado
confusion is even
y creo
greater
que
than
esto
I
está
had
tomando
anticipated.
bastante trabajo,
And
pero
I
que el
think
trabajo
it's
está siendo
taking a lot of
exitoso en la medida en
effort,
que
but I think
estamos
we are
logrando
being
cambios
successful
concretos.
in bringing
Otro tema
about concrete changes. Another
importante que de alguna manera está muy
important
relacionado a los estándares
topic that
éticos
is again closely related to
internacionales
international
es
ethical standards
la urgencia
is
de evitar
the
la exclusión categórica
urgent
de ciertas
need
poblaciones de
to
las investigaciones.
categorically
Todavía tenemos
exclude
muchos
certain
estándares
parts of the population.
nacionales,
We still
muchas
have
normativas
many international
nacionales que
standards,
prohíben
international
la
regulations
investigación
that
con niños,
forbid
prohíben
research
investigación
with
durante el
children
embarazo
or
o
during
investigación con
pregnancy
personas
or
mayores o a veces
research with
incluso los propios
elderly.
investigadores
Even the
dicen,
researchers
no, no, pero
themselves say, no, no,
no,
we
no,
can't
pero
work with children,
erradiquemos
or
a todas las
no, no,
embarazadas del
we
estudio.
can't
Cuando
include
tantos
any pregnant
niños,
women in the
personas
study. When many
embarazadas,
children
personas
or
mayores
pregnant women
tienen el
or
derecho de poder
older
tener
people
medicina
have
basada,
the
una
right
medicina
to
basada en la
have
evidencia.
medicine that's
Pero esa evidencia solamente va
evidence-based for
va a
them.
existir
But
si
that
los
evidence is
involucramos de
only
manera
going to
ética y
exist if we
responsable en los
involve them
ensayos
in
clínicos
an
y en la
ethical and
investigación en
responsible
general.
way in our clinical
Entonces creo que
trials and
vamos,
research.
este es un tema en
So
que en la OPS hemos avanzado
this is
mucho
an
en que
area where
Zika,
we've
pero todavía
made a lot of progress in SICA, but
creo que de la,
I
del
think
consenso teórico a la
from
puesta
the
en práctica,
from the area
hay
of
algunos
theoretical
obstáculos que
consensus to
debemos
practical
sortear. O sea, nos
implementation,
estamos
there's
quedando
still
todavía
some
un poquito
obstacles we
atrapados.
have to overcome. We're still
Y
stuck a bit.
el
And my
desafío es exactamente la
last
línea con la que se dijo
challenge
antes, la
is
necesidad de sumar esfuerzos.
similar to what has already
Como
been said.
eticista,
In other
a
words, we
veces hago la
join
broma de que
efforts.
la
As
gente
an
cree que
ethicist, I sometimes
el-
joke that people
quien
think
trabaja en ética es alguien
that
que
those who
está
work in
entrenado
ethics
profesionalmente
are
para decir
people
no
who
a
have
todo.
been professionally trained to say
Y eso no
no
es,
to
la
everything.
ética y la
But
eficiencia no están
ethics and
peleados, al
efficiency are
contrario. Sí,
not
tenemos la obligación ética de hacer
contrary to one
investigación,
another.
porque la
If we have
investigación tiene el
the
potencial de
ethical
mejorar la salud y el bienestar
ethics to
de
do
nuestras
research,
poblaciones.
because
Por eso esa
our
obligación
research will
ética
affect the well-being of
conlleva la
populations, that
obligación de
ethical
hacerlo de la
research
manera más
means
eficiente,
that you have to
más
do it in the
rápida,
most
más
efficient,
no solamente más
quickest,
rigurosa,
and
que
most
también más
rigorous way
eficiente
possible.
posible.
Not just the most
No
rigorous,
tenemos,
but the most efficient way
no tenemos
possible.
por qué desperdiciar
We shouldn't
esfuerzos, recursos, tiempo.
waste our
Y creo que
efforts, our resources, our time.
este es un tema
And
en que
I
estamos
think
insistiendo mucho
this is something
recientemente.
we've been insisting a lot on recently.
Tenemos algunas
We
iniciativas,
have
algunas las
some
mencionó Ludovic,
initiatives.
pero por ejemplo,
Ludovic mentioned
podemos hacer las
one.
cosas de una manera más organizada,
We can do things in a more
sumando
organized
esfuerzos, viendo cómo las
way
hacemos en
by
los distintos
joint efforts.
lugares.
Look
Estamos
how others are
trabajando,
doing
algunos de ustedes
things.
saben,
Some
por
of
un
you know
seminario
we're
previo
working
entre
on
nosotros
creating
en
another
estandarizar los
seminar,
modelos de
and we already
contratos,
had
de
one on
pólizas de seguro.
standardizing
Todos
contract
queremos lo
models,
mismo. Si nos
insurance
coordinamos, lo
policies.
podemos hacer
We
de una
all want
manera
the same.
eficiente.
And
No
if
creo
we
que nadie
coordinate,
quiera
we
dejar a
can
los
do it in the
participantes
best way possible. I
desprotegidos.
don't think
Todos
anybody
estamos
wants to
con el
leave their
mismo objetivo.
participants
Veamos que
unprotected.
la
I think
manera
we
sea
all
la
have the
misma
same goal,
para poder
but let's try to
proceder de la
join
manera más ágil
effort
posible.
so as to reach
Lo
our
mismo,
goal in the
y
most
para
efficient
crear
and
lo
flexible
mismo
way
con
possible.
los
Also,
protocolos
in terms of
preaprobados, otra
the
manera en que
pre-approved
pudiéramos hacer la
protocols,
investigación
another
más
way we
eficiente,
can make
más ágil
research more efficient and
y
more
también
flexible
en general con miras a sumar
and
esfuerzos y
to
construir sobre el
by joining
aprendizaje de
efforts
otros,
and build
evitar
on
repeticiones
what others
innecesarias.
have
No es
learned
que más
so as
veces
to
sea
avoid
mejor algo,
repetition.
hay que
To
hacer
do
más aunque
something
mejore.
more and more doesn't mean
Creo
that it's
que
better.
tener
You
los
just have to do
foros
it
que
better.
hemos
Point.
establecido,
We
por
need to
ejemplo, el
have the
foro de
forum
todas
that
las
we've
autoridades
established. For instance, the
nacionales
forum
que
on national
supervisan a los
authorities
comités de ética de
that
la
supervise
investigación
ethics
son
and
una
research
oportunidad
committees.
de
That
juntarnos,
fora is an
sumar esfuerzos y
opportunity
ver cómo
for us to
operamos de la
work
manera más
together and see
eficiente.
how we
Creo
can
que hay muchas
operate
cosas
in a
por
more
pensar
efficient
aún,
way.
pero vamos,
I
me
still,
parece
there's
que
a
vamos
lot
por lo
more
menos
room
bien
for thought,
encaminados.
but I think at least we're moving in the right direction.
Gracias, Carla.
Thank you, Carlos.
Patricia,
Carla.
adelante.
Patricia, go ahead,
Bueno,
please.
yo quería, ante todo, bueno, agradecer la
First of all,
invitación
let me thank you for the
y
invitation
poder compartir con
and
ustedes ya
for the
desde
opportunity to
una
share
visión no
my
del
vision
conjunto
with
de
you.
los ensayos
My vision is
clínicos,
not
sino
about
de la
the
perspectiva de
overall
las
clinical
agencias
trials, but
regulatorias
rather
nacionales
from the
y los
perspective
ensayos
of the
clínicos
national
que van a dar
regulatory
lugar
agencies and the
a nuevos
clinical trials
registros de
that will
productos.
give rise to new product
Siempre teniendo en
registration.
cuenta que
Keeping in mind also that,
como dijo Francisca,
as Francisca
las
said,
agencias regulatorias nacionales
the
son una
national
parte de los
regulatory
actores
agencies are
y
only
ensayos
one
clínicos no son
of the many
solamente
stakeholders, and
ensayos
clinical
clínicos
trials
para
are
el
not
registro de un
just
producto
clinical
sanitario.
trials
Entonces, una
to
política de
register
investigación
a health
interesa a
product.
los
So
ministerios de ciencia y
research
tecnología o a las
should
ciencias de ciencia y
involve the
tecnología
ministries of
y a los
science and
ministerios de
technology, as
salud
well as the
que
ministries of
la
health,
coordinarán
who
después
will
entonces
be the
las
coordinators
políticas
of
de ética
the
de la
ethics
investigación y de
policies
investigación
for research
en los
and
países.
will coordinate the research in the
Lo que ven
countries.
las agencias
What
regulatorias
the
es
regulatory
un universo
agencies
mucho más chico de ensayos
often
clínicos,
see
son
is a
los
very
ensayos
small
clínicos que
universe of
van a dar
clinical
lugar
trials.
a un registro
These are
sanitario,
clinical
y
trials that
ahí es
usually
donde
lead
yo me voy a
to
situar para decir cuáles son los desafíos.
health licensing.
El
And here's
primer
what I'm going
desafío
to
es que
focus
la
on the
región
challenges.
es muy
The first
vasta y
challenge
tiene
is that our
niveles de
region
madurez
has
muy diferentes
very different
en la
levels of
función de
maturity
supervisación de los
in the
ensayos
area
clínicos,
of supervising
mientras que hay
clinical
algunas
trials. There are
agencias regulatorias
some
que son
regulatory
miembros de la
agencies that are
ICH,
members of
hay
the
algunas
ICH.
agencias que
There
aún
are
no
others
tienen
that
sector de ensayos
do
clínicos
not yet have
dentro de la agencia
a department on
regulatoria
clinical trials
nacional.
within the national
Entonces,
regulatory agency.
estamos trabajando
So We are working to try to standardize the regulatory rules so as to make sure that all rules and regulations are consistent with the highest research standards. Last year, for instance, new regulatory standards were developed in the region, and we set up the Forum for Regulators of Clinical Trials, where most of the national regulatory agencies are participating. There, they spoke and exchanged information on the function of supervising a clinical trial. They spoke about the challenges, analyzed what are the indicators we need to have, what kinds of procedures we need to have to improve efficiency, which is one of the many challenges. As Francisco said, this is only one of the many areas we have to improve on. Another area is that efficiency is tied to the number of human resources devoted to that activity and to the training of other human resources. Efficiency means also that the regulatory agencies need to have in place clear, transparent, published procedures that they follow for the performance of these procedures so as to gradually be able to improve. There needs to be, therefore, harmonization and procedures in place to bring us to a regional standard that is consistent with international standards. But there are other items I'd like to refer to.
First, the regulatory agencies in the region, with just a few exceptions that have the full development plan of a given product, they tend to look at these clinical trials in isolation. They don't see the whole series of clinical trials that are being conducted to develop a given product. So they see just a little part of the whole picture. This creates complications, and it tends to leave people to neglect some of the functions of their regulatory agency and mix up the role of the regulatory agency with that of the ethics committee. I say this because often in our regulatory agencies, we have a lack of accompaniment or support for the development plan or an accompaniment plan that says what we expect, how the design should be, follow up with the design, how you do non-clinical studies, what clinical studies are anticipated, and what the sample size will be. In other words, they need to give opinions, support, give advice, and be there all along the way. It's not just an analysis of the protocol, but rather very close monitoring of what is happening with that protocol, and also oversight and inspection of best clinical practices, and then follow up on safety, and then finally analysis of the results. This means it has to be an agency that has the kind of vision that clinical trials that not only need to protect the health and well-being of the participants, but they also need to make sure that the data that comes out is accurate, because this will lead to regulatory decisions as to whether to approve a product or not approve it. And this falls within the activities of the regulatory agency. I'm saying this because one of the problems in the region is that many agencies that have just recently gotten started, they just put all their effort into analyzing the protocol, but they forget all of the rest of it. There might be an agency that starts it, but reliance is very little applied in our region. If there are agencies that have done all of this work, then that might help agencies that are just getting started. It might help them make their job easier. So these kind of mechanisms need to be used. And to get them used, then they need to be provided for in the procedures, the rules and procedures. So for reliance, this is one of the biggest challenges the region currently has, and much more so within the framework of new health technologies. Not everyone is going to be able to understand everything very quickly. So it is good to also establish communication with regulatory agencies that have already gone down that path previously. And this is a tremendous challenge that we always discuss at the forum, is that of transparency. The publication of trials that are looked at by the regulatory agencies, and the publication which includes where they are done, which ethics committee approved it, when was it approved by the regulatory agency, what's the trial all about, and then finally looking at the results and the assessment by the NRA. This is important. Sometimes they go through these clinical trials, but without all of this other necessary information that we need. And this has to be considered by people who want to participate, and they look for that information. This information needs to be transparent and clearly available in order to help people decide what is being done and whether they have any kind of special need to learn this information, they know where they can find it. So this is one of the points that I wanted to make. Thank you for your thoughts, Patricia. There are various questions. So perhaps I will start with the first one. They say that sponsors are now looking only for large numbers of patients, so their focus is only on very large countries. This could be a challenge. And the specific question is how to convince those sponsors to include smaller countries with high quality standards and strong regulations, but smaller populations. Perhaps, Francisca, you could kick us off responding to that. Yeah, okay. I was thinking I might be the one who would answer that. I don't necessarily agree that sponsors look for countries that have a larger population. They also want to recruit patients that isn't necessarily directly related to the country's population side. For example, a lot of clinical studies are done and are not done in such large countries. For example, in this case, you might find Chile, a country with a 19 to 20 million population, bigger than many countries in the region, but it's number 5, and the number of clinical trials per population is the highest in the region. And I think this gets back to a more relevant factor, which than the population size of a country, and that is what we were talking about before, which is that primarily these regulatory processes. So the smaller countries that have a smaller population need to be more careful or place more stress on having suitable and efficient regulatory processes so that more clinical trials can come into their country. And then they need to have more publicity in order to have a chance of recruiting more participants. And maybe I can take advantage of this opportunity to address some other points that came up in the discussion, just to try to organize them a little bit. First, Patricia in particular was mentioning this at the end. We need more indicators, not only on the implementation process, but also the impact of clinical trials. Because once again, I want to stress that it is important to convince the countries that it would be a very relevant health policy for the country and for the inhabitants of the countries to have a clinical trials policy. And a little while ago, I had to make a presentation and looked up these indicators in this data. And for example, what struck me was there wasn't data out there. There was just one country in which I found that the government, for example, had some data on this. It was only Argentina. Chile had another kind of data. They do a survey of the chamber that I work at, and then in Mexico, the same was done in the local association. In most cases, there's data, but it's not available in terms of the number of clinical trials conducted in each country, where they are taking place, how many investigators are involved in this, what are the ethics committees that are approving these trials, and it's even harder to find data on how long it takes to get approval from ethics committees and regulatory agencies. Going back to the case of Chile, it's when the data is there, it's hard to understand. Chile has an Excel spreadsheet, but you have to look at the centers, etc. But it's very hard to analyze that data. Therefore, if the public data is available, it has not been analyzed, and it doesn't really show us the results of indicators. And one practice that I think we should incentivize is regarding the execution process, but they have to focus also on the results, not only the results of a given clinical trial, but rather the participation of people in the trial. Argentina had some data on this, but this is a very common practice in England. Everyone who participates in a clinical trial receives a satisfaction survey afterwards so that they can improve the process and also motivate future participation. Now, going back to the question that Sarah was asking, I think the essential thing is the expeditiousness and efficiency of the approval processes, both in the regulatory agency and the ethics committee, and drafting of contracts so that people can participate as a research center. And then we have the other parties. Let's say there's a country that has less capacity to recruit patients because they have a smaller population. It's essential then to work on this recruitment. The next step is to make sure that there are centers where the clinical trials can be implemented. And you have to make sure that it's not just the private sector, but also the public sector. In Chile, 90% of clinical trials are conducted in the private sector, similar in Argentina and Brazil. You also need to improve the dissemination and the recruitment processes. People need to understand what the clinical trials are. Physicians need to invite their patients to participate in a trial. And also, we need to leverage something we've discussed a little bit, but we have to look at digital tools such as digital medical records, which make it easier to identify patients who are suitable to participate in a clinical trial. Sarah says, thank you, Francisca. Would anyone else like to add something on this point? because if not, then I can go on to another question. Luis Felipe had mentioned the issue of improving the professional credentials of researchers. So we have a question on this. How could we encourage investment in the clinical researcher? What can we do with academia and international cooperation? Are there any proposals that you might have to tell us about? Thank you, Sarah. I do think it's important to point out two different scenarios, and perhaps one initial scenario is better known in the region, and that's what Francisca's talking about. And certainly the question in the Q&A box is about clinical trials sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry or someone else who designs the trial, as Carla was saying. The clinical trials have a different scenario. This is more or less in the hands of professionals. There are CDOs. There's an established system of payment per patient, and for each of the various types of participants in these clinical trials. And it's not just those who bring in solutions to the problems of the region. Those of us who are participating in something that's the result of a multinational initiative. And I agree with Francisca. What we really need is a very agile regulatory system, which makes it possible to join clinical trials very quickly. And academic clinical trials are a completely different animal, or those that are not sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry. These are the trials that we tried to do during COVID. These are the ones that generate a research question that is applicable to the region, but which potentially don't have a market interest for the pharmaceutical industry. We believe that it is possible to conduct such clinical trials. In recent years, we have conducted clinical trials without much funding, but these have been generated and implemented in the region. It is possible to do this, but when I refer to making this more professional, I'm saying whether the physician or nurse or caregiver for the patient might identify a research question that would be relevant to the region and the world, I would say. I don't think that we're so different from the rest of the world, and the science generated in our region would likely be useful to many other people in other countries. These are people who do not have the time or economic recognition for performing this work. I think that the way that this could be resolved is by first offering training. And being a health professional does not necessarily make one a scientist. We do understand this. The fact that I take care of a patient in an ICU does not necessarily mean that I'm an expert in clinical research design or methodology. So if health workers are interested in doing science, well, that's very important. And another thing is that is the first step towards creating scientific professionals in clinical practice. And then there's another very important part, and that is that stable funders from either the private or public sector should not interfere in the development of scientific research itself. That is very important because it's a completely different model from that which is sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry. So we need people who have training, and we could establish this training in conducting clinical trials through people's clinical practice. And the other thing is to strengthen the funding mechanism for these clinical trials. Some money should be available and protect the time of researchers. If there is a nurse who is doing science, that person cannot do scientific research at the same time that they're taking care of patients. So we need to make sure that someone be hired to care for the patient so that the research nurse can do the scientific experiment during their work hours. So we need to not force people to do research activities at 3 o'clock in the morning when we're very tired and can't think straight. If we're health workers, we shouldn't have, we need people who are scientists that want to learn, and we need some guidelines to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts and to not waste resources on something that won't have an impact.
Thank you, Felipe. It's very interesting what you mentioned. And this whole thing about professionalization. Carla, do you want to say something? Yes, I was going to say something about also in the ethics committee. Yeah, we also have that same problem. We all want ethics review that is good, rigorous, and well done and done yesterday. But also, ethics committee people shouldn't be paid because they're the poor guys in history. The researcher charges, but the members of ethics committee are like the charity nuns of the Scientific Research Corporation. And that's no longer applicable, not just for those who haven't noted that detail. It's an issue that has come up over and over from all perspectives. And at each one of the sessions we had, when we started in October 2020 in the midst of COVID, because it's a very precarious system. And like all precarious systems, it works when things are doing well, but during COVID in our region, it exploded. So we need to acknowledge the time required. If you need good and quick ethical review, it takes time. I'm not going to do it at 3 o'clock in the morning. We have cases of ethics committees in the region where we take our hats off to them because of their devotion that they give to their task. But it shouldn't be something they have to do at 8 o'clock at night or on the weekend or meet in a casino because they don't have space to meet with others. And I'm not inventing this. This is actually something that happened with an ethics committee in the region. So we need to be consistent with what we expect. We want rigor, we want professionalization. Well, then we must see what that implies. We want ethical review to be quick and serious. Well, then we must make sure that the time of those who review protocols, which is not something you can read at 9 o'clock at night, not and even worse yet at 3 a.m., it has to be something that's recognized. It's part of the person's daily task. Either you pay them for that or you pay them separately for the service, but it's another very important aspect of what Felipe said. I completely agree with you, Carla. And I am speaking from my own bias, which is that of a researcher, but you're saying they pay researchers, but they pay them to take care of the patient, not to do the science. That's where the ambivalence lies. You need to recognize the time of the ethics committees, the researchers, the statisticians, in other words, everyone who is doing science. And we move away from this model of that everybody can do everything at the same time for the same amount of money. No, I think we have to differentiate and we also have to acknowledge the time it takes. I wanted to add my perspective
Yo entiendo, primero
I
o sea, creo que es muy distinta la
I think that
investigación académica a
academic
la
research
investigación
is very different
financiada,
from
ya sea por la
research that
industria
is financed
farmacéutica o
by
otros
the
sectores,
pharmaceutical
que tiene
industry
ribetes distintos,
because they have
pero las dos
different
son científicas,
objectives,
¿está
but
bien?
both are
Porque
still
la
scientific,
investigación
right?
esa de productos
The research
financiados va a
for a
dar
product
lugar
that's
a
financed
productos que después toma toda
will
la población. O sea
lead
que
to a product that the entire
tema
population
para
ends
mí
up
es
taking.
central porque si
So
no
that's important
quedamos
to
como
me
un gap
because
entre una y
if
otra.
not, we can create a
Ahora,
gap
dicho
between the
esto,
two. Now, having said that,
para la investigación que Luis Felipe acaba
the
de decir,
research
tiene
that
que haber
Felipe
un
just mentioned,
plan
there has to
de
be
investigación.
a research plan.
Ciencia y tecnología tiene que desarrollar
Science
cuáles
and
son las
technology
prioridades
has to
nacionales y
establish
también
what should
tiene
be
que
the
ver
national
cuáles son
priorities and
los gaps
also
que hay para que se pueda
determine what
desarrollar,
gaps exist that
el
need to be
financiamiento,
filled so that you can
la
find the financing
capacitación, los
and
recursos,
provide the
etcétera.
training and the
Y hay
resources that
ejemplos
are
de eso
needed.
en la
And we
región.
do have
Cuando
examples of
hubo
that in the
buenos
region.
planes,
When we had good
generó
research plans,
productos
it did
incluso que son
lead
más
to a
complejos a
product
veces,
that
como
is
vacunas.
sometimes more
Y esto
complex than
existe en
others,
la
such as
región.
vaccines, for instance. This
La otra
exists in the region.
investigación, la que no es con
And
productos,
the
debiera
other
ser lo
research
mismo.
that's not
Debiera
for a
ser
specific
plan,
product should be
parte
exactly
de
the
un
same.
plan de
There
ciencia y
should be a
tecnología,
research plan
porque si no
under
es
the
el
Science and
esfuerzo
Technology
individual.
Ministry, because
Vos
if not,
salís a
it's
buscar
just an
financiadores, la
individual
enfermera, a ver en
effort.
qué
You
tiempo
go
lo
out to
hace,
find
el
somebody
comité
who
de ética
finances
pelear
you,
por
the
si se puede,
nurse tries to find the time,
esto tiene
and
que
when to
ser
do it,
parte
the
de una
ethics
política
committee
nacional de investigación.
discusses this.
Este
So,
es el
but
punto
that
primero,
should
que es
not be
lo
the
que
case. It
falta en
should
la
be
mayoría de
part
los
of a
países de la
national
región.
research policy, which is what's missing in most of the countries
Dicho
in the region.
esto,
Having said this,
yo creo que, bueno, para poder ser
I
más eficientes,
think that in
hay una
order to be
serie
more efficient,
resguardos que hay que tomar. No es solo
there are
acortar los
several
tiempos,
safeguards that
y
have to
no
be
es
taken.
solo
We don't only have to shorten the
ser,
time
digamos, capacitarlos.
from approval
Tiene que
to
haber
implementation.
también
We don't
un
only need to
acompañamiento
provide
en
training.
los
There also
procesos,
has to be
y eso
support
es
of the
totalmente
process.
necesario.
That's
En términos,
absolutely
y con esto
necessary.
termino, de lo que,
In
Luis
terms of
Felipe
what
comentó acá,
Luis Felipe
las
mentioned
agencias
earlier,
regulatorias nacionales,
the
cuando esa
national
investigación
regulatory
es una
agencies,
investigación de un producto que no es
when they're looking at the
financiado por la
research,
industria
a
farmacéutica,
product that's
resulta
not
que
financed by the
esos que
pharmaceutical
están
industry,
desarrollando el producto
then those who are
necesitan una
developing the product
orientación.
need
Y esa
guidance,
orientación
and that
también la puede dar
guidance
en parte la agencia regulatoria a
can be
través, por
provided
ejemplo,
partially by the
FDA
regulatory
y la Agencia
agency.
Europea se reúnen
For
con el
instance, if
investigador, la
FDA and the
agencia
European
española
agency meet with the researchers, as well
ayuda
as the Spanish agency,
digamos, los
and they
investigadores
help
en
the
el proceso.
researchers
Bueno, es
throughout the
necesario
process.
también en
Well,
nuestra región
in our
desarrollar
region,
las normas
we
para ese
also
sector,
need to
para ir
develop standards for
acompañando,
that
porque ¿qué
sector
pasa? A veces
so as to
ese
support them.
sector
Because what
desarrolla
happens?
algo y cuando
Sometimes
con
that
un
sector
gran
develops
esfuerzo,
something
por
with
ejemplo,
enormous
estudios
effort,
no clínicos,
say
cuando
not
llega a la
clinical
agencia le decía,
studies,
no,
and
no
then
te
when they
dio
get to
eso.
the
Y
agency
gastó
says,
toda la
no,
plata que
we
le
don't
habían
want this.
dado en
And
un
they
subsidio
spent
en
all the
hacer
money
algo
they
que
had been
después
given,
no
a
les va a
subsidy
servir.
to do
Entonces, ese
something that
acompañamiento
doesn't
no
provide
lo
any
puede
result.
desarrollar
So
la región,
that's
porque
why that
existe en
kind of
otros
support
lugares.
needs to be
En
developed
todos
in
los,
the region.
digamos,
It
en los
exists
lugares
elsewhere
de mayor
in the
desarrollo de la investigación,
countries
hay un
where research is
acompañamiento
highly developed. There
del
is
llamado sector
support
académico, si lo queremos
provided
llamar
to
así.
the
Si
so-called
está
academic
desarrollando
sector.
algo,
If
tiene que
they are
poder
going to
ser
develop something,
orientado
they have
por
to
la
be
agencia
guided
regulatoria, por
by the
ejemplo, y a ver qué
regulatory
es lo que quiere
agency
al final, cómo lo
to see
quiere,
what it is the agency actually
y que
wants
haya un
in the end,
consenso
how
ahí
they want
y
this to be
una
done, and that
orientación.
there is
Esa también es
agreement and
parte de las
guidance
tareas de la agencia regulatoria.
provided. That's part of one of the
Gracias,
tasks of a
Patricia.
regulatory
Tal vez
agency.
quiero
Thank you,
ahí insistir
Patricia. Here, let me insist a bit, and maybe you can clarify. What is the role of a national regulatory agency? What kind of clinical trials do they oversee, and which ones do not fall under their area of expertise? Because there's talks about clinical trials of medications that have already been approved for the usual doses, and what kind of requirements are required for those types of clinical trials. So could you shed some light on this? A national regulatory agency oversees clinical trials within the area of application. In other words, trials that are going to give rise to a new health license or change an existing license, which has approved a new doses, a new therapeutic indication, or equivalent studies to look at, say, a generic product. But the scope of application is for health registry or licensing. If there's any change required in the existing registry, or for instance, include a new population that had not been studied before for that use. That is the scope of the regulatory authorities for any of the health products, for medication, for vaccines, all the biological products, of course, all biologics, for medical devices, any of those products. That's the role the national regulatory agencies have. As such, out of these clinical studies comes data, which will then give rise to the decision that the regulatory agency will make about licensing or not. That's why it's so important that the data be exact, accurate, data on the basis of which you can make a decision. Because if a bad decision is made, it hurts the entire population, not only that country, but if they're multinational, multicentric studies, it will also impact the population of many countries. So it's very important for them to keep in mind that in addition to approving, they have to oversee safety and make sure that the data provided was done according to good clinical practices. And for that, inspections are required, not only inspections of the clinical researcher, but also of the sponsor. Thank you. Very clear. This leads me to another question that Carla may shed some light on, which is on the ethical guidelines of SIOMs and good clinical practices, because there's an overlap. What's the difference between the two? How do they overlap? Well, how do the different standards differentiate from one another? Well, it's sort of as if we're talking about a lasagna. So imagine, I'm going to go to the horizontal version, but right now, imagine this circle is all the research, including all human beings, all research in all areas. A subgroup is biomedical research, because there's other types of research, public health, for instance, which is not part of biomedical research. Within biomedical research, you have clinical trials. These are not perfect concentric circles, but within the clinical trials are the clinical trials that are looking for the authorization of a new medication or device. That subgroup is the one that Patricia was referring to. Now, if you turn this over and put it on a vertical position, it's as if there was a lasagna, but a very small layer, which is the regulatory oversight, is applied to all the ethical standards that involve research with human beings, which are the research standards. But imagine, not all clinical trials seek to authorize a new product, or a device. I could do a clinical trial where I authorize a population to eat a
Entonces, ese
hard-boiled egg
ensayo
once a
clínico,
day.
por supuesto, no
That clinical
necesitará la
trial
fiscalización de la
doesn't
autoridad
need
regulatoria nacional.
oversight of the
Sin
national
embargo,
regulatory
necesitará lo que
authority.
aplica a
However, it
todos
will
los
need
estudios de investigación
what
con
applies to
seres humanos,
all
que es la
research
adherencia a los estándares
studies with human
éticos
beings,
de
which is
ciencia.
adherence to the SIOM's
Sea un estudio
ethical standards,
epidemiológico,
whether it be a
un
epidemiological
ensayo
study
clínico de
or a
medicamento, el ensayo
clinical
clínico del
trial on
huevo duro, un
medication
grupo
or on
focal, un
hard-boiled
estudio
eggs,
con
a
muestras que
focus
tienen
group,
nombre y
or a
apellido de
study on it with
personas,
samples that have the names
casos
of
y
individuals,
controles,
or
todos esos
all of
deben
those
hacerse siguiendo los
need to be
estándares
done according to
que establecen
ethical
la pauta del
standards
SIOMS, por supuesto la declaración de
established by
Helsinki también, pero
SIOMS,
yo suelo
also the
referirme
Helsinki
a las
Declaration, but I
pautas del
usually
SIOMS porque una
refer
declaración
to
es
SIOMS
una
guidelines because
declaración, entonces es
a
muy
declaration is
breve.
only a
Las pautas del
declaration. It's
SIOMS
very
son
brief,
más
whereas SIOMS
robustas en el sentido que
guidelines
nos dan
are much more
explicación necesaria.
robust. It explains
Todos los
why
detalles que
it
nos quitan
goes
el
into
sueño a
all the
veces.
details that
Entonces,
don't
la
let us sleep at night at
investigación en
times.
salud con
So
todo lo
research,
que es investigación con seres humanos
all that has to
debe
do with
hacerse
research
con
with
previa
human
aprobación
beings
ética de un
has to be done
comité,
with prior ethical
siguiendo las
approval by a
pautas del
committee,
SIOMS.
following
Y esto no
SIOM's
importa si eres
guidelines.
estudiante
And
o
it
no
doesn't matter
estudiante.
whether
La
you're a
investigación
student
con
or
seres
not.
humanos se
If you
hace
do
siguiendo
research with
estándares
human
éticos.
beings, you have to
Un
follow ethical
subconjunto
standards.
muy
Now, there's
pequeño
a
de
very
estos,
small subgroup of
además de
those,
los estándares
which,
éticos,
in addition to the
además de la
ethical standards, in
supervisión que
addition
hace un comité de
to
ética,
supervision done
tienen
by
además
an
la
ethics committee,
supervisión
are
regulatoria,
also
la lo que llamamos
supervised
la fiscalización del
or
ensayo clínico a
overseen
cargo de la ARN, siguiendo
by
las buenas
the
prácticas clínicas, como decíamos.
RNA following
Entonces, y
clinical
cada uno mira
practices,
cosas
as
distintas. No es que uno hace
Patricia
uno o el
said,
otro. No, no, no. Cada
the,
uno
the
desde
National
su
Regulatory
ángulo, desde
Agency.
sus
So it's
estándares,
not
incluso
that everybody
si a
sees
veces
things from their own
mira lo
perspective.
mismo, lo
No,
mira con
even though
criterios
it's
distintos, con
looking at the
o
same
haciendo
thing
un
and
análisis
seeing it from a
distinto.
different
Entonces es
criteria,
fundamental que
doing a
cada uno
different
haga su
analysis.
parte
That's why
y
it's so
que
important for each person to do
la
their
capa más grande
part.
de la lasaña no se
That
encoja. Tenemos países
to
donde
make sure that
solamente
the
se pide
largest part of the
revisión
lasagna
ética
doesn't shrink. There's
sobre el
some
ensayo
countries that
clínico
only
y
ask
el
for
resto de la
ethical review
investigación
with the
se hace a la de
clinical
Dios.
trial. And
Pero
if
ni
it's
tampoco que
just
se
research,
expanda,
well,
porque a veces también
there's no
tenemos
supervision.
países donde las
But we
buenas
also
prácticas
don't want this
clínicas,
to
que son
expand,
el
where
estándar que
the
usa la autoridad
countries where the
regulatoria nacional,
clinical
se aplican
trials
a
who
todo,
use
incluyendo una
national
encuesta.
standards
Lo
apply
cual
it to everything. In fact, just a
es un
survey.
despropósito porque nunca
That
es un estándar que nunca
there's
se
no
concibió
purpose to
siquiera
that.
para eso
It's a
y se
standard
acaba
that was not
generando
even
ineficiencias,
designed for that purpose, and it
casi
just
diría que
leads to
no son,
inefficiency.
hay muchas ineficiencias con las que
I
nos
know there's a
encontramos
lot of
y
inefficiencies
que
that
tenemos
we
que son
encounter
esperadas. Esto es una
and are
ineficiencia, digamos,
expected, but this is
inesperada que cada vez
a,
espero que
a,
tengamos
an
menos en la región.
inefficiency that I really hope we have less and
Gracias,
less of in the
Carla.
region.
Hay varias
Thank you, Carla.
preguntas sobre el
There are
tema
several
de la
questions
estandarización. Se
on the
mencionó,
question of
digamos, esta
standardization.
falta de estandarización
Somebody
como
mentioned
una
the
de las
lack of
barreras para poder
standardization as one of
realizar
the
de manera
barriers to
efectiva, ¿no? Con
to
eficiencia, perdón,
having
ensayos
efficiency,
clínicos. Cuando
efficient
hablamos de
clinical trials. And when we
estandarización, tal
talk
vez
about
podrían
standardization,
mencionar
maybe
estandarización de qué
you could
procesos,
talk about
qué implicaría
standardizing what
estandarizar
processes. What does it
como
mean
solución y tal
to
vez
standardize?
si
And
tenemos algunos avances concretos
if you
sobre
could give us some
estas
concrete
estandarizaciones.
examples of something that's been
¿Me entendieron? ¿Me
standardized.
deja entender?
Did you understand my question?
Sí, no, ¿quieres, Patricia, empezar? ¿Quieres que empiece
Patricia,
yo?
do you want to
Trabajamos
start
muy
or do you
cerca.
want me to start?
Estandarización con respecto,
Standardization
por ejemplo, a la documentación que hay que presentar
on, for instance, the documentation that has to be presented
para los efectos del ensayo clínico,
to do a clinical
estandarización
trial.
en cuanto, por
Standardizing
ejemplo, a qué debe reportarse, en qué
exactly what
tiempos.
needs to be reported within what time frame.
Esas son algunas de las
Those are some
estandarizaciones
examples of
que tienen que ver con la agencia
standardization that applies to the regulatory agency.
Una sola cosa digo, para eso existen justamente
Now,
los estándares. Y
that's
entonces
exactly
creo
why
que
standards
lo
exist.
que hace a los productos que, digamos, los ensayos clínicos que
Now,
van
if
a dar lugar
we're talking about
a
a
un
clinical
registro
trial
sanitario, modificar
that
un
is
registro,
going
los que
to
entran dentro del
lead
ámbito de
to
aplicación de las
health
ARN,
license,
el estándar actual es la
and
ICH.
and
Entonces, la
what
ICH
applies to
marca muy
all
claramente
NRAs is the
qué
ICH.
es lo
ICH
que se
very clearly
agencia
defines
y también
what a
qué debe
national
reportar, qué
regulatory
plazos
agency has to
debe
include,
reportar.
what it has to
Y
report, and
esto
within what
ayuda a
time frame it has to
estandarizar. El
report.
tema es
That's
cuando
what helps us
nos
standardize
ponemos
things.
creativos en la
The
región.
problem
Cada
arises when
punto
we
de la
become
ICH
creative in the
fue
region.
consensuado por
Every
expertos y por esta
point
gente.
in the
Es
ICH was
importante
agreed
saber
to by
que
experts. That's why it's there.
yo a veces veo,
And that's
voy a poner un
very
solo
often,
ejemplo,
let me give
que
you just
dicen
an
que le
example. I
reporten
sometimes hear
todos los
people say,
eventos que ocurren
you
en
should
el país. Pero
report
bueno,
all the
eventos no
events that
son
occur in the
necesariamente
country. Well,
relacionados,
events may
eventos pueden
not
ser
be
cualquier cosa, ¿qué hacen
necessarily
con eso? ¿Le reportan el
related.
resultado? No.
And
Entonces, es
what
importante
purpose is
saber
it?
lo
Why
que
do you need to
dicen
do
es
this?
qué se debe
And they
reportar,
realize
cómo
it's
se
not
debe
necessary.
reportar y en
So that's
qué
why it's
plazos
important to know what needs to be
está
reported,
puesto ahí
how it
y
should be
sea
reported,
analizado
and
por
within what
expertos
time
para
frame.
saber
And this
que
is
es la
all be
mejor
done on the
forma para
basis
poder
of
tomar
experts who met
decisiones
and
muy
decided this is
rápidas
the
con
best way
respecto
to help
así tengo que
will
modificar
reach quick
algo, tengo que
decisions.
modificar el protocolo,
That's
tengo que agregar criterios
if they may have, for
incluso no
instance, have
tengo
to
que
modify
cortar
the
un estudio.
protocol or
Entonces
cut a
eso
study.
es importante.
That's
Ir
why
a
it's
los
important
estándares,
to have
¿bien? Que nos va a
standards,
ayudar también como
because
región
it's going to
a
help
estar,
us as a region
digamos, en coordinación con todo el
to
resto del mundo.
be in coordination and consistent with the rest of the world.
Bueno, yo agrego algunas cosas a lo
I
que
would
dij-
like
lo
to
que dijo
add a
Patricia.
few things
Efectivamente,
to what
tenemos
Patricia
estándares
said.
internacionales.
It is
Tenemos
true that we
estándares
have
éticos, tenemos
international
estándares
standards, we have
regulatorios. Y
ethical
un
and
primer paso
regulatory
de una
standards, but the
estandarización
first
es no
step
ponernos
towards
creativos, sino
standardization
seguir los
is to
estándares
get
internacionales.
not so much to be
Eso
created,
es
but to
un
follow the
trabajo de base
international standards. This is the baseline work
venimos haciendo con muchos
that
países de la
we've been
región.
doing with many
Creo que
countries
ya
in the
todos nos hemos dado
region.
cuenta que no
I
nos hace
think
falta,
all
hay
of
mucho
us
trabajo por
have
hacer, no hace falta
realized
ponernos a
that
reinventar la rueda.
there's
Si hay
a
un
lot of
estándar
work to be
internacional,
done, but we
lo
don't need to
adaptamos. Hay otras
reinvent
cosas que
the
todavía
wheel.
tenemos
If
que
there's
ponernos a
already an
descifrar
international
nosotros mismos.
standard, we
Pero que
need
todas las
to, we can adapt
normativas
it. The other ways we
nacionales
do need to
relevantes adopten
change
los
more, but
estándares
if
que
everyone
corresponden y
adopts the
además para el
standards
ámbito para el que
that
fueron
correspond
diseñados.
to
Eso
the
es
sphere
un
for
trabajo
which they were
importantísimo,
designed, that is
incluso una
extremely
manera como
important
estamos
work that's
haciendo.
already
Si yo les
underway.
cuento, en los últimos
And we're
15
doing
años,
this, if you
cómo
might
han
look at over the
cambiado
past
las
15 years,
normativas de
seeing how much
Latinoamérica.
Latin American
Específicamente, yo les
standards
diría
have
que
changed
antes todo el
specifically.
mundo
I would
miraba los
say that
estándares
before,
internacionales y
everyone
decía,
looked
o
at
bien
the
trataba de
international
copiarlos y
standards
pegarlos o
and
contarlos
just
de
tried to
nuevo
cut and
con sus
paste them
con sus
or
propias
to
palabras.
draft
Acaban
them in
siendo
their
documentos
own words,
larguísimos,
and these
pero
wound
luego
up being very long
evolucionaban los estándares
documents. But then
internacionales
the
y vaya usted y
international
cambie la ley.
standards would evolve, and
Era
then
la
you
de nunca
change the
acabar.
laws,
Ahora
and it was an
tenemos un
endless
abordaje más
exercise.
eficiente.
Now we have a more
Queremos que se
efficient
adopten los
approach.
estándares
We
éticos
say that we adopt
internacionales.
international
Apareció
ethical
la Declaración de
standards,
Helsinki y
the
su versión
Declaration
vigente.
of
Entonces, si
Helsinki and the
aprendimos algo,
SIOMS in their
bueno,
current
ya seguimos
version.
actualizados, usamos
So
nuestras energías en
then we're
aprender cosas
continuously
nuevas, no en
updated.
estar
We're learning new
modificando
things, and we don't just
corriendo
have to
como
continuously
como un
running
cuy
like on a
ahí en
treadmill,
una jaulita, en
changing
círculos tratando de
things, or
mantenerse
like a
¿verdad?
gerbil on a
Eso
running
es
on a
en lo que
wheel.
compete a una
So
parte del trabajo
this
que yo creo
is
que todos
part
entendemos
of the
por
work that I think we
estandarización, que
all
es
understand in
adoptar
terms of
estándares
standardization,
internacionales.
which is to adopt
Pero hay unos
international
temas para
standards.
para
But
los
there are
cuales los
some
estándares
issues for
internacionales
which the international
no son
standards
suficientemente detallados.
are
Porque
not
se enfocan
sufficiently
en el
detailed because
objetivo,
they
por ejemplo,
focus perhaps
no en
on
la
a
manera
given
exactamente como se hacen
objective,
las
but
cosas.
not
Se
exactly how
enfocan en la
things should be
sustancia.
done.
Por
In
ejemplo,
other
¿qué
words,
hace
they
un
focus
estudio
on the
éticamente
substance.
aceptable?
What
Más
does
no en
an
la
ethically
manera como
acceptable study do?
hacemos
But
el
this
proceso de
doesn't really
revisión.
tell you the
Entonces,
what the whole review
simultáneamente
process
al trabajo de
consists of.
estandarizar,
So
en tanto
as we
adoptar estándares internacionales,
simultaneously adopt
estamos viendo
international
cómo
standards, we're
armonizamos
also looking at
nuestros
how we can
procesos, nuestras maneras
harmonize
de
our own
trabajar,
processes
nuestros
and
requerimientos
work
para
methods
aquellas
and
áreas en las que
requirements
los estándares
for areas
internacionales no
in
sean
which the
suficientemente
international
granulares.
standards
¿Por qué? Porque hay
are
muchas maneras
not
que están
granular
bien de hacer
enough
la misma
because
lo
there
mismo.
are many
Pero
good
claro,
ways of
si todos
doing the same
escogemos la
thing.
misma manera,
But if
entonces es
anyone
como
selects the
más ágil
same
el proceso.
uh,
Y ahí es
way
donde
of
hay
doing
mucha
things, then the
competencia aún.
process
Si
becomes more
ustedes van a las
expeditious. There are many ways
recomendaciones,
to look
nuestra
at this. If you
orientación,
look at the
catalizar la
recommendations
investigación
in
ética
our
en
guidance to
agencias, verán
catalyze
que tenemos cuatro tipos de recomendaciones.
action during emergencies. Well, there are some that are for emergencies and some that are not. One of the most interesting things about COVID is that we learned many things that don't only apply to emergencies. We realized if we want to do this quickly in an emergency, why don't we always do it quickly? So there are many such recommendations. In addition to having the division between emergency and non-emergency, we also have a split between things that we could already implement because it's obvious that they need to be done. But there's another line of things in which we know we have to do it, but we still do not know exactly how to do it. And we have to put our heads together. We have to think through how we can tighten the screws so what we know we have to do better, we can figure out how to do it. As is always true in life, you say, we'll learn how to do this, and then we come down to earth and figure out how to do it. So we need to work also as a region in this, and we are working on several projects that are aligned with the WHA resolution and aligned with our regional workshops, and also aligned with this catalyzing ethical approvals during emergencies, like what we prepared during COVID. For example, do we have to do so many reviews? Could we work together? So instead of having 3 processes, we do one together. Of course, understanding that it has to all of the appropriate rigor. But if we can better coordinate and we're clear that everyone is working towards the same objective, perhaps we might figure out a more efficient way to do this. And so really we've needed to reflect on this for some 10 years now in order to avoid so many multiple processes. There are many alternatives to be explored, but we need to explore them. Another example that's mentioned there, because this is another lesson that we learned from SICA, that is pre-approved protocols. We had a session on this, or we're going to have one soon. Master protocols. Why don't we anticipate this and put together certain structures? We've learned so much about this in the region, in SICA, and I think that we should build on that because nobody has an excess of resources. So if we could think of a way to standardize certain processes in a way that does not sacrifice rigor, ethical rigor, and rigor in terms of the data that the NRA needs, then why don't we do this? And so that is one of the objectives of our work at PAHO. Thank you. Patricia is talking. I think that the Forum on Clinical Trials really helps regulators to share experiences in this regard, as Carla was describing. Francisca, did you want to add something? I think that really Carla said it very well. It's important to stress that standardization should not be synonymous with rigidity, but rather a process that facilitates and expedites the development and implementation of research, but without sacrificing the quality or ethics of the research. And here I would like to mention 2 examples, and perhaps 3 positive examples and 1 negative one. In 2017, for example, Argentina adjusted its standards with this effort to expedite processes, and this ultimately translated into an increased number of clinical trials that were conducted in the country. And thanks to all of the work that it's been doing, identifying indicators, modernizing its standards and everything, this has led to clinical research increasing in the country, particularly over the past year. The same is true with Brazil. I shared a link to the National Research Plan for 2020, but last year, Brazil, I'm losing track of the years, but I think it was in the middle of last year that Brazil adopted a law with some changes to update standards related to clinical trials and expedite the processes. For example, to expedite ethical and regulatory approvals with some deadlines. Mexico has also launched some changes, and these are clear examples that have made it possible to increase the number of clinical trials conducted in those countries. In Brazil, we haven't fully felt the impact of this yet, but Brazil is a very interesting case because it's so large. There were some barriers for the regulatory, ethical, and other approvals, but so they didn't have the number of trials you might have expected of a country that large, but now this is being updated, and I imagine that we will get a relevant increase in the number of clinical trials in that country. And we also are looking at how you can modernize and improve standards and modernize them, make them more efficient, and that will allow you to carry out more, not only more pharmaceutical industry clinical trials, but what these regulations impact the most is academic research, because that's even harder for them to overcome these barriers. And so if a researcher cannot prove that the technology they are assessing or evaluating in their trial, then that it's valid, then it won't spread to other countries. So what we have seen, and this is something that we have seen, going back to Chile, is that many researchers have had to leave and conduct their research in other countries because of the barriers they find in their home country. And so we need to work on this and think of the impact that it might have on that the modernization and standardization may have. Luis Felipe speaking, it is important to know or bear in mind that science has evolved as well. And this harmonization and standardization of processes needs to also bear in mind that the clinical trials are very different from what we saw before. And we bring in these new designs and new challenges. This is where we find the biggest differences in opinion between the regulators and the ethics officers. So there are some things that we've been doing for years that have already been harmonized in a certain way. But if on top of this, we say that now we're talking about clinical trials using platforms with the lesion analyses, this is much harder for regulators to understand who've been doing this, or for ethics boards members who have been doing this without being professionals, and it's harder for them to understand new things that come out today. So we need to be skilled and develop standardization models that depart from what is classical. And we should reach agreements about the new things that show up. Otherwise, we're going to keep getting further and further behind, and this is going to continue to pose problems for researchers and those who want to generate science locally. Thank you very much, Patricia, Carla, Francisco, and Luis Felipe. I think that we could keep talking for 2 hours longer, but I'm going to give the floor to Ludovic now to wrap up today's seminar. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. And my thanks to each and every one of the panelists, Francisca, Luis Felipe, Patricia, and Carla, and also to Vasi, who was with us at the beginning of today's webinar. As you can see, there are quite a few issues that have been identified here, and a large number of strategies as well. We are a point in which we see new challenges as well as new opportunities, and we need to rethink and reinvent science for our region. This is imperative, and we need to find solutions to make all of this efficient and to improve quality. Another point that I did not hear stressed was the need to promote basic sciences as well. If we want to conduct research and clinical trials, in addition to what is done with industry in the region, we need to have a good basis of basic science in order to conduct different kinds of studies. So that's one point. In addition, amongst the new challenges is that there are also clinical trials being conducted with artificial intelligence tools. This is also something that is going to be increasingly impactful, and it's something we don't have very much experience with, and it also poses an opportunity for the region. So I think that there are several new challenges and others that we've been discussing for many years, but we all need to move on to action as researchers and international agencies and decision makers and agencies, regulatory agencies, and also patients and people who participate in the various aspects of these trials. We all have a role to play. So on my behalf, I would just like to thank all of the team, the interpreters and all of the team that helped organize this, Silvina, Kim, Magalis, and everyone who has helped to organize this webinar. And finally, new tools are going to be published on our portal. And the Clinical Trials Accelerator is also improving, and we will be in touch with you. And we hope that the countries will make use of these tools. Thank you, everyone, and a very good afternoon.